Welcome to week 6. We're talking about project lifecycle, editing, mixing. Specifically within mixing, we'll be looking at automation techniques within DAWs. And then we're going to look at how you can create your own sound walk composition using the techniques this week. How exciting. Okay, let's get going. So, as a sound artist, sonic artist, you will need to be familiar with the entire production process or project life cycle of creating a work. Obviously, as a creator or creative, one of the first things that you're worried about is the actual creative process. And we're going to spend a lot more time talking about that as the semester goes on. And additionally, you're going to look at different types of creative processes in future sonic arts classes, media arts classes, art classes, music technology classes, etc. Creative process is something we spend a lot of time studying here and that we'll spend a lot of time thinking about. It's not easy. I don't mean to just write it off as though it's not something to think about or talk about or that doesn't exist. Rather, it's just something that we're going to keep working on. And it takes time to get good at. It takes time to figure out how to have ideas. It takes time to get good at implementing those ideas. And so you'll work on it. It'll be great. But as a sonic artist, you also, in addition to being able to come up with the ideas and actually create the work, need to have the tools and techniques, of course, to implement that work and create that work. And as well as that, you need the tools and techniques to take that work and transform it into something that other people want to experience. Essentially creating and following standards for how we work with, tweak out, and distribute audio or sound. Let me pull something up here. So one of the things that you're going to read in the homework in the content this week, of course, is this idea of the project life cycle. And you can see that right here. And so the project life cycle, obviously, there's this idea of initial conception, this large area of creating. We'll spend some time talking about that in a moment. Technical mixing, mastering, and then distribution, which I kind of left off of here. So the initial conception, this is where you get an idea. This could come about from working on another project, a walk in the woods. If you're getting paid, maybe this is something that you're being paid to do. Someone is telling you exactly what the product is that you need to be creating. So there's lots of ways to come to this. We're going to obviously skip past that for the moment. The creative portion is the one that we're interested in today and this week. And I don't mean to be flippant about it, but again, we're going to ignore some of the actual how to be creative portion and more talk about techniques that you can use in the creation itself. If you're a painter, if you're working on painting, obviously the canvas, the paintbrushes, and the pigments or paints themselves become the tools you use. As a sound artist, we need to know how to use our DAW, microphones, mixers, etc., as the tools that we actually use to make our sound art works. Within the creative process, there's a lot of techniques that are actually going to be duplicated and also utilized within the technical mixing process. And this isn't common way of looking at these things. This is kind of something that I'm breaking down for you in this Intro to Sonic Arts 1 class. But essentially, there's composing, creating, in which we actually might go out and record sounds in the field, record sounds in the studio, synthesize sounds with synthesizers or other types of instruments, get found sounds that we get off places like freesound.org, archive.org, Library of Congress. Maybe you sample something from other recordings and bring all of that type of stuff in. And then, of course, we start to arrange and edit that material in time. Sound art is obviously a time-based art form, and the relationship of sonic events to each other is critical to our understanding and experience with that art form. As a sound artist, you're interested in how you can develop pieces over time. We'll talk about at some point, either in this class or another one, the idea of non-time-based sound art, which is a misnomer, of course, but we will get into it. But for you right now, you have to be working in time. Things that happen from moment A to moment B and how they relate to each other are what gives us meaning. And then, of course, there's the mixing stage, in which someone moves or works to create balance in relationships with loudness, respect to loudness, frequency ranges between sonic events. And what you notice in this project life cycle here is that between the composing, creating phase, the recording or the actual getting sound into the DAW, the editing phase and the mixing phase, there's no direct path that you follow. These are going to be fairly fluid. And you might move between many of these pathways in non linear ways in which you bring in a sound and you mix it a little bit in regards or in reference to other sounds. And then you might realize that the timing of the way you've got the sounds is off. So you'll go back and work on some editing. And then you'll say, oh, but I need some more sounds to create the X effect that I'm trying to do. So you'll go compose, create, record, find some other sounds. You'll bring them in and mix them a little bit further. You'll contemplate the timing of everything. You'll go back and mix a little bit further. You'll add some more sounds. You'll delete some sounds. This can be a very messy process, this creative process. Here's the big takeaway that I want you to get from this. I want you to contemplate your job as a sound artist as having, I'm sure you've heard this analogy before, but hats that you might wear. And when you're in the creating phase of a sound art piece, I want you to put on your creator hat. And you're concerned with what is the effect that this piece causes my listener? What am I, if I'm trying to accomplish something aesthetically, does this piece achieve that effect? If I'm trying to create some sort of feeling or tell a story or develop characters or whatever it is that might go along with the creative process, you're really digging in during this creation stage and paying attention to how the piece works as an artwork. What you're not doing is you're not worrying about technical aspects of, is this mixed up to industry standards? Is this edited in a way that is following best practices? Is this mastered and ready to get distributed? Those things are in this technical area here. When it's time for that, when you're done with the creative process, you've worked on everything, you've built up this piece that you're proud of, it accomplishes what you want it to, you're going to take off your creator hat. And I want you to put on your technical hat. We haven't talked about this at all this semester, but mixing and editing and mastering, which is another part of the phase that we're going to talk about in a moment, are technical skills that have creative aspects to them, certainly have their own art. And I would never say that someone's who's a mix engineer or mastering engineer is not a creative person and that there's not an art of mixing, because there certainly is. And it's something to be learned in itself. And that's what we're starting to do now. What I am suggesting is that when it's time to actually take the composition or the sound art or whatever you want to call it that you've created and start to really tweak the relationships of sounds to each other over time, it's time to put on that technical hat. And you stop worrying about composition. You stop changing sound events in time for the purposes of achieving greater narrative or greater meaning effects. And instead, you listen for micro adjustments. Is the loudness of these two sound sources with each other allowing for both of them to be heard in the way that I want to at this moment or over the course of this project? Are the attacks of these individual sources in line with each other, or are they fighting with each other? Is the flow or the feel of this piece with respect to the sound color or the timbre even throughout the entire project? And there are a number of technical aspects that we're interested in pursuing here that I want you to focus on when you put on that technical hat. And the other area we haven't talked about yet is mastering. And mastering is the process of actually taking a final mix. So in this technical editing and mixing stage, you're working on individual elements, relationships to each other. You're working on the amplitude relationships over time to each other. You're making sure that your mix doesn't cause the listener to have to turn up or turn down the mix as time goes on. You're hoping that you're not hurting your listener's ears. All of that's happening in the technical mixing stage. Usually you're taking multiple sources, multiple tracks, and you're mixing those down into a single file, be that a mono audio file, a stereo audio file, which is probably going to be the most common type of output, or some sort of multi-channel immersive audio output. When you finish with that editing and mixing stage, you're going to take off your technical mixing hat. You're going to output this bounced file, and then you're going to put on your mastering hat. And we're not going to talk about mastering a lot in this class at all. But mastering is the process of taking a final mix and really preparing it for the outside world, for getting it ready for distribution, making sure that if it gets played before or after other projects that are similar to it, that it's going to sound the same and kind of stack up. If you're working on a hip hop musical piece, when you play it after some other hip hop piece, you want it to sound similar. You want it to have a similar type of loudness. You want the sound color or timbral characteristics of this work to probably be similar to that what you're hearing before. We have certain specifications for how we want to hear like the kick drum and the vocals placed in the mastered mix. So in that mastering stage, we're trying to take things and we're turning them, we're tweaking them and getting them ready for this distribution and for the final output. And not only are we dealing with mastering about making our projects and taking them and getting them ready in comparison to other similar types of projects, but we're actually preparing the final mix for whatever the format is that we're going to put this piece out on. Oftentimes that might be streaming via Bandcamp, via SoundCloud, via Spotify. It might be going to YouTube. Maybe this is a video, a piece of sound for video. So we're taking it to YouTube. Or maybe you're cutting something onto a vinyl record. And so there's different specifications from a mastering perspective that we need to get things ready for a vinyl record. So mastering is that kind of finish up process. And we'll go into that a lot more in later classes. Regardless, though, I want you to think about these processes and these differences, this idea of initial conception, composition, creation, devising as kind of their own box, and then technical mixing, editing as its own discrete process, and then mastering and distribution as its own discrete process, in which you're actually taking off a hat and putting on a different one. A lot of sound artists, musicians, etc., sound designers get in trouble for being too free-flowing between the barriers and borders of these processes. And not that there's advantages to be had by allowing all of them to become very fuzzy on those lines. But when we're trying to develop a set of technical skills or creative skills or artistic skills, I think it can be more useful for you if you try to be a little bit more methodical in the way that you're developing these techniques and a little bit more methodical in the way that you are going about the creation of your works. The other dirty secret, and it's not dirty, but the other reality is that on big budget projects, there would be a separate person for most of these processes. I give an example of a traditional popular music type piece. And there might be an executive producer overseeing it all, a song or track producer who gets the beats and the instrumentals in line, someone who writes the lyrics, the artist, of course, who records the vocals. There'd be a tracking or recording engineer who actually lays things down to tape. There'd be an editing engineer who makes sure that onsets, attacks, releases of notes, all those types of things occur in time in the way that they need to. This same person may end up being in charge for making sure that pitch corrections or tuning issues are taken care of, or it might be another person. There oftentimes will be a separate editing engineer who gets the project from the mix engineer or the editing engineer. There might be oftentimes a separate mix engineer who gets the project from the recording engineer or the editing engineer and then mixes it. And likewise, there's almost always a separate mastering engineer. Those processes is really good to have a separate mix engineer and mastering engineer and get separate ears on the project. And then finally, of course, there'd be someone who specializes in distribution and getting the project out. You have to learn all of these skills for the time being. And what will happen potentially as time goes on is that you'll find yourself feeling more comfortable or enjoying or being more attracted to individual portions of this process. And then you'll dig down and you'll get really good at those portions of the process. And then I hope that you can find work in those portions later on in life as you choose to do so. For the time being, though, as I mentioned, you've got to learn it all. You've got to be able to do it all. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important that you can discreetly look at these different skills, because it's going to help you learn to be a good mix engineer, recording engineer, creator, composer. And if you ever do get in the situation in which you're getting to collaborate on a larger team, you'll understand the relationship of each of these discrete categories. And when someone says, I want you to compose something for me or produce a track for me, you'll know where that means and where you stop. And you'll know essentially what are the lanes that I stay within. What are my responsibilities and what are someone else's? Great. I'm really excited for you to keep working on some of these ideas. Please read this page. If you got any questions, of course, post them to the class issues forum.